What happens when two cops, fueled by prejudice, pull over the wrong car on a quiet suburban street. They see a black woman in a hoodie and make an assumption that will unravel their entire world. They think she's just another statistic, someone they can intimidate and push around. But they've made a fatal miscalculation. They've just put handcuffs on a decorated United States Army general. And when she makes her one phone call, it won't be to a lawyer. It will be a direct line to the Pentagon. Stick around to hear the shocking, true-to-life story of how one woman's quiet strength and a single phone call unleashed a storm of karma that would obliterate the careers of two officers who thought they were above the law. The late afternoon sun of a crisp October Tuesday cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawns of Oak Creek, Virginia. It was a town of old money and new ambition, a polished enclave for Washington, D.C., as elite where the silence was a commodity and appearances were everything. For Brigadier General Isabella Dubois, it was simply home, or the closest thing to it she'd had in a 28-year military career that had taken her from the dust of Kandahar to the sterile corridors of the Pentagon. At 52, Izzy Dubois wore her rank with an easy grace that belied the immense pressure it carried. She didn't need the star on her shoulder to command a room. Her presence did it for her. It was in her steady assessing gaze, the kind that could dissect a complex battlefield strategy or see right through a flimsy excuse. It was in her voice, a calm and measured alto, that could soothe a nervous private or dress down a colonel with surgical precision. But today there was no uniform, no star, no entourage of aides. Today, she was just Izzy. She wore a simple grey zip-up hoodie, worn-in running tights and a pair of scuffed but comfortable Brooks running shoes. Her hair, a cascade of tight salt and pepper coils, was pulled back in a practical ponytail. A thin film of sweat glistened on her high cheekbones. She was on her cool-down walk after a 5-mile run, her preferred method for unwinding the tightly coiled spring of her professional life. Her route took her along the winding, oak-lined streets of her own neighborhood, a place she had chosen for its tranquility. Her car, a 5-year-old dark blue Lexus sedan, was parked a few blocks from her house near the entrance to the wooded trail where she began her runs. It was a deliberately unremarkable vehicle, the kind that blended in with the sea of luxury SUVs and sedans that populated the driveways of Oak Creek. General Dubois had never been one for flash. In her world, substance always trumped style. As she approached her car, stretching her calves against the curb, she was lost in thought, mentally reviewing the briefing materials for the next day's meeting with the Secretary of the Army. It was a complex logistical problem involving force readiness in the Pacific Theater, and her mind was tracing supply lines and deployment schedules. She was so absorbed that she barely registered the slow crawl of the Oak Creek County Police cruiser as it passed her. Inside that cruiser, Officer Michael Calloway tapped his partner on the shoulder. "Check it out, Frank. 3 o'clock. Officer Frank Miller, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his uniform shirt and whose face was a permanent mask of weary cynicism, glanced over. "What, the jogger? Yeah," Calloway said, his voice laced with the bored, arrogant confidence of a man who had only been on the force for 4 years but was convinced he'd seen it all. He was young, fit, with a sharp, angular face that was often set in a smirk. "Been getting a lot of calls about car break-ins in this sector. People scoping out the neighborhood. She fits the description." Frank grunted, not bothering to ask which description. In this part of town for Calloway, there was only one description that mattered when it came to suspicion being black. "She's just walking to her car, Mike. She lives here, probably. Lives here, Calloway scoffed, slowing the patrol car to a near stop. Driving that maybe, but look at her, dressed like she's ready to smash and grab, just hanging around. Let's go talk to her. Can't be too careful. Frank Miller sighed. He was 10 years Calloway's senior, 2 years from his pension, and tired. He knew this was a bad stop. He knew Calloway had a chip on his shoulder, a need to prove he was a real cop, even in a town where the most common crime was teenagers getting caught with expensive fake IDs. But arguing with Calloway was more exhausting than just going along for the ride. It was easier to let the kid play sheriff, have a chat, and be on their way. It was a laziness he would come to regret more than anything else in his life. "Fine," he mumbled. "Light her up." The words were barely out of his mouth before Calloway flicked the switch and the serene afternoon was slashed apart by the sudden lurid pulse of red and blue lights. The chirp of the siren was brief but sharp, an unnecessary punctuation mark. Isabella Dubois looked up from her calf stretch, her brow furrowing in confusion. The police cruiser was angled behind her Lexus, its lights painting the trees in frantic alternating colors. She was the only person on the street. She straightened up, her mind shifting instantly from logistics to analysis. Okay, stay calm. There's no reason for this. She'd given countless de-escalation trainings to her soldiers over the years. Now it seemed she would have to be her own student. She took a slow, deliberate step away from her car, making sure her hands were visible. Calloway swung his door open, his movements aggressive and theatrical. His hand was already resting on the butt of his Glock, a gesture that was both standard procedure and a naked display of intimidation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice artificially deep and loud. "Stay right where you are. Keep your hands where I can see them." Frank Miller exited the passenger side more slowly, his movements heavy, his face impassive. He positioned himself to the side, taking up the classic tactical position. Isabella stood perfectly still, her face a mask of neutral calm, though a cold knot of anger was beginning to tighten in her stomach. It was a familiar feeling, one she had hoped her rank and accomplishments might one day insulate her from, but knew they never truly would. This was not a traffic stop. This was a statement. "Good afternoon, officers," she said, her voice even. "Is there a problem?" Calloway swaggered toward her, stopping a few feet away. His eyes roamed over her, taking in the hoodie, the running tights, the sweat. His gaze was dismissive, contemptuous. "That's what we're here to find out. What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The question was so loaded, so dripping with accusation, that it took Isabella a moment to process its audacity. She was standing on a public street 100 yards from the driveway of the home she had a mortgage on. "I'm on a walk," she replied, keeping her tone level. "I live here." Calloway let out a short, humorless laugh. "You live here?" "Right. What's the address?" She gave him the address without hesitation. He shared a skeptical look with Miller. "And this car," Calloway said, hooking a thumb toward her Lexus. "This yours?" "Yes, it is," she said. "License and registration." It wasn't a request. It was an order. "They're in the glove compartment," Isabella said, nodding toward the car. "May I have your permission to retrieve them?" She was being deliberately formal, painstakingly polite. She knew the script. Any sudden movement, any perceived defiance could be twisted and used against her. She was a black woman, facing 2 white police officers who had already decided she was guilty of something. The star on her uniform meant nothing right now. In their eyes, she was just a suspect. "Pop the trunk first," Calloway commanded. Isabella blinked. "The trunk? Why?" So I can make sure you don't have anything in there you shouldn't," he said, his voice hardening. "We've had reports of stolen property. Now pop the trunk." This was wrong. This was a clear overstep. They had no probable cause to search her vehicle. Frank Miller shifted his weight, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face before it was replaced by his usual stoic mask. He knew this was a bad search, but he remained silent. His silence was his complicity. Isabella's training, both as a soldier and as a black woman in America, screamed at her to comply. Don't argue. Don't resist. Survive the encounter. But another part of her, the part that had commanded battalions and earned the respect of 4-star generals, bristled at the raw, undisguised prejudice. She was being treated like a common criminal on her own street. She made a calculated decision. She would comply, but she would also document. Her mind was already a recording device, noting the time, the officers' appearances, their exact words. "My keys are in my pocket," she said slowly. "I am going to reach into my right pocket to retrieve them." Calloway tensed. Slowly. She moved with the deliberate, economical grace of a person trained for high-stress situations. She pulled out her keys and pressed the button. The trunk of the Lexus popped open with a soft hydraulic hiss. Inside there was a folded emergency blanket, a first aid kit, and a set of golf clubs. Nothing else. Calloway peered inside, his disappointment palpable. "All right. Now get your license and registration, and leave the car door open when you're done." Isabella walked to the passenger side, opened the door, and leaned in to open the glove compartment. As she did, her military ID, encased in its plastic holder, fell from the sun visor where she'd tucked it. It landed face up on the passenger seat. She retrieved the registration and her driver's license from the glove box and straightened up, turning back to the officers. As she did, Calloway, who had moved closer, glanced into the car and saw the ID. He leaned in, squinting. "Brigadier General Isabella M. Dubois, United States Army." He froze for a fraction of a second. Then a slow, condescending grin spread across his face. He looked at her, then back at the ID, then back at her again. His eyes filled with disbelief and scorn. "Well, well, well, Frank," Calloway called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Looks like we got ourselves a general here." He picked up the ID card, holding it between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were contaminated. "You a general, a real one." He chuckled. "Sure you are, lady. And I'm the King of England." The knot of anger in Isabella's stomach, once cold and tight, now burned white-hot. The condescension, the blatant mockery. It was a deeper wound than the suspicion. He wasn't just questioning her presence. He was dismissing her entire life, her decades of service and sacrifice. She kept her voice dangerously quiet. "Officer, that is my identification. I suggest you look at it closely." "Oh, I'm looking," Calloway sneered. "These things are a dime a dozen. You can buy them on the internet." Nice try, though. Adds a little something to the whole "I live here" story. He tossed the ID back onto the seat dismissively. "I'm done with this. You're being evasive. You fit the description of a suspect in a series of felonies. I'm placing you under investigative detention." Before Isabella could even process the words, he moved. He grabbed her arm, spun her around with a roughness that was entirely unnecessary, and slammed her against the side of her own car. The metal dug into her hip. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice no longer calm but sharp with outrage. "Put your hands behind your back," Calloway yelled, his face inches from hers, spittle flying from his lips. "You are being detained. Frank Miller, whose job was to be the calming presence, the senior officer did nothing. He simply watched his hands on his belt, his expression unreadable. His silence was a green light. The cold metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut around Isabella's wrists echoed in the quiet afternoon air. It was a sound of absolute finality. The steel was tight, biting into her skin. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. She, a general in the United States Army, a woman who had advised senators and briefed cabinet secretaries, was standing handcuffed on a public street, treated like a piece of garbage by a patrolman with a god complex. Calloway yanked her upright and began patting her down, his hands moving over her body in a way that was meant to be clinical but felt deeply violating. "Officer Isabella," said, her voice now hard as granite, "you are making a catastrophic mistake." Yeah, save it for the judge, General," Calloway mocked, pulling her away from the car. "You have the right to remain silent." He began reading her the Miranda rights, the words a garbled, insulting drone. Isabella wasn't listening. Her mind was already shifting. The de-escalation phase was over. The survival phase had been passed. Now the strategic response phase was beginning. He thought he had all the power. He had no idea what was coming. The world narrowed to the biting grip of the handcuffs and the smirking face of Officer Calloway reflected in the car window. Each word of the Miranda warning he recited was another shovel of dirt on the grave of his career. He just didn't know it yet. For Brigadier General Isabella Dubois, the initial shock and humiliation were rapidly being replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. It was the same focused rage she'd felt years ago in a dusty command tent in Bagram, when a subordinate's incompetence had nearly cost the lives of 3 of her soldiers. It was a clarifying anger, one that burned away all extraneous emotion and left only the mission, and the mission now was accountability. "Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you, Calloway?" Finished, his tone smug. "I understand them perfectly," Isabella said, her voice devoid of any of the tremor he might have expected. It was flat, hard, and final. "I also understand Article 93 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice concerning cruelty and maltreatment of a subordinate, and while I am not in your chain of command, I assure you the principle of professional conduct is universal. You have failed that principle on every conceivable level." Calloway just stared at her, the reference flying completely over his head. "Whatever, lady. You can play soldier all you want in the back of my car." He began to steer her toward the cruiser's rear door. Frank Miller, who had been a silent, hulking statue, finally spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Mike, let's just run the plates and her ID. Maybe we take the cuffs off, write it up as a field interview, and call it a day." Miller wasn't motivated by a sudden pang of conscience. He was motivated by the first prickle of fear. Something about the woman's unyielding composure was setting off alarm bells in the back of his pension-protecting mind. This wasn't the usual scared suspect or the screaming, indignant civilian. This was something else. Something dangerous. "And let her go." Calloway shot back, incredulous. "After all this? No way. She's got a mouth on her. We bring her in, let her cool off in a cell for a few hours. Teaches her some respect." For Calloway, the stop was no longer about a non-existent series of break-ins. It was about dominance. He had been challenged, however subtly, and his ego demanded he win. "This is your stop," Mike Miller said, abdicating his responsibility with a shrug. He opened the rear door of the cruiser. Calloway pushed Isabella forward. She didn't resist, but she also didn't make it easy, moving with a stiff deliberation that forced him to use his strength. As she ducked her head to get into the back seat, the vinyl smelling of stale cigarettes and disinfectant, she looked directly at Miller. Her eyes were like chips of obsidian. "You're the senior officer here, aren't you?" she asked. Miller avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on a crack in the pavement. "Just get in the car, ma'am." "Your name is Miller," she stated, reading the tag on his uniform. "And his is Calloway. I want to make sure I have that correct." Calloway slammed the door shut, cutting off any reply. The world outside was now framed by a metal cage. She watched as he walked back to her. Lexus picked up her military ID from the passenger seat and strutted back to the patrol car, getting in the driver's side. "See," Calloway said to Miller, holding up the ID again as if it were Exhibit A, "Brigadier General. Total fake. If she was a real general, she'd have a driver a whole motorcade, not driving this Japanese sedan." Miller just grunted and started tapping Isabella's driver's license information into the onboard computer. The system was slow, the connection lagging. As they waited, Calloway kept glancing in the rearview mirror, trying to get a reaction from his prisoner. But Isabella was perfectly still, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the middle distance. She was no longer in the back of his car. In her mind, she was in a command center, planning her counter-offensive. The first step was to assess her assets. Asset 1, the truth. Asset 2, her position and the power that came with it. Asset 3, the officer's prejudice and overconfidence, which was now her greatest tactical advantage. They had underestimated her so profoundly that they had handed her all the ammunition she would ever need. "Okay, license is clean," Miller mumbled after a minute. "Registered to Isabella M. Dubois at 1420 Willow Creek Lane, right here in Oak Creek. Car's clean, no wants, no warrants." Calloway's face tightened. The facts were inconveniently refusing to align with his narrative. "So what?" "The ID is still bogus. She probably stole the car and the license. That's it. We're charging her with auto theft and possession of a forged government document." Miller looked at his partner as if he'd lost his mind. "Mike, the car isn't reported stolen and the license matches the registration, which matches the address she gave you. We have nothing. Literally nothing. A judge will laugh us out of the courtroom, and the DA will probably send us a bill for wasting his time. We have resisting arrest," Calloway insisted, his voice rising. "She didn't resist. You slammed her against the car before she could even blink. She was being verbally non-compliant." "That's not a thing." Miller shot back, his voice finally cracking with frustration. He lowered it again, glancing nervously toward the caged woman in the back. "Look, let's just say we made a mistake, take the cuffs off and get out of here. We can say we misread the situation." Calloway's jaw was set like concrete. "No, I'm not backing down. We're taking her in." He put the car in drive, but before he could pull away, Isabella spoke from the back, her voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "Officer Calloway." He glared at her in the rearview mirror. "What?" "Before you compound your error any further," she said, her tone utterly devoid of pleading, "I would advise you to listen to your partner. He seems to possess at least a vestigial instinct for self-preservation. You, on the other hand, appear to have none." The insult delivered with such clinical precision hit its mark. Calloway's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "That's it. You're done talking." "On the contrary," Isabella replied smoothly. "I believe I am entitled to a phone call. I'd like to make it now." Calloway laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You get a phone call at the station, sweetheart. That's how it works. Actually, Department policy in Oak Creek County Section 4 subsection B allows for a call to be made in the field if it can resolve the situation and prevent an unnecessary booking, thereby saving departmental resources. I can quote the rest of it for you if you'd like. I read the entire county charter and police manual before I moved here. It's called situational awareness. Miller and Calloway stared at each other. She was right. It was an obscure policy, one they never used, but it existed. Miller suddenly felt a cold dread seep into his bones. Who was this woman? Just let her make the damn call. Mike Miller urged, his voice now a low, desperate hiss. What's the harm? Who's she gonna call? Her mummy? Calloway. Seething, but also momentarily thrown off his game by the laser-like precision of her knowledge, hesitated. He was trapped. If he refused, and she was right about the policy, it was another mark against him. If he let her call, he could mock her when nobody important answered. Fine, he snarled, pulling out his personal cell phone, since they were forbidden from letting detainees use their official equipment. He didn't want to hand her the phone, so he'd dial and put it on speaker. Who you calling your public defender? Isabella ignored the jibe. She craned her neck to look at him, her eyes holding his in the mirror. I need you to dial a number for me. It's a Washington, D.C. area code. Spit it out, Calloway grumbled, ready to punch in the numbers. She recited the 10-digit number from memory. It was not a number you could find in a phone book. It was a number she had memorized for absolute world-shaking emergencies. It was the direct line to the duty officer at the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, NMCC, a line that bypassed all switchboards. But she wasn't going to stop there. Calloway punched in the numbers and hit the speakerphone button, a smirk on his face. He held the phone up. The line connected on the very first ring. A clipped professional voice answered, a voice that sounded like it ran on coffee and pure authority. Command Center Duty Officer Colonel Evans speaking. Calloway's smirk wavered. Miller's eyes went wide. That did not sound like her mummy. Isabella's voice filled the small space of the patrol car. It was a voice transformed. The calm, measured tone was still there, but it was now imbued with an unmistakable aura of command. It was the voice of a general officer addressing a subordinate. Colonel Evans, this is Brigadier General Isabella Dubois. Serial number Delta Bravo 704-982. I apologize for the unconventional contact. There was a pause on the other end, but not of confusion. It was the sound of a man snapping to attention, even over the phone. General Dubois, ma'am. No apology necessary. We have you. Are you in a secure location? Is this a continuity of government event? The colonel's voice was suddenly tight with alarm. An unscheduled call from a general officer on an open line was a serious matter. It could mean anything from a personal emergency to the start of World War III. Calloway's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like he might faint. He was still holding the phone, his hand trembling slightly. Miller looked like he'd seen a ghost. His mouth was hanging open, and a low moan escaped his lips. Colonel. Negative, Isabella said, her voice reassuring but firm. I am not in a secure location. I am currently in the custody of the Oak Creek County Police Department, handcuffed in the back of a patrol vehicle. My current location is approximately 300 meters east of the intersection of Sycamore and Hillcrest Drive in Oak Creek, Virginia. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Colonel Evans was likely trying to process how a one-star general ended up handcuffed in a police car 5 miles from the Pentagon. "Ma'am, I don't understand," the colonel stammered. "There isn't much to understand," Colonel Isabella said, her gaze locking onto Calloway's horrified eyes in the rearview mirror. "I was detained while on my daily run by 2 officers who have mistaken me for a car thief. Their names are Officer Calloway, badge number 72, and Officer Miller, badge number 45. They have been unprofessional, disrespectful, and are about to charge me with possessing a forged government ID, namely my own." She let the words hang in the air. In the background, on the other end of the phone, she could hear the colonel's voice, now muffled but urgent. He was no longer talking to her. He was shouting orders. "Get me the Provost Marshal General on the line, now! And get me the Vice Chief of Staff's office. I want a location. Ping on this call. Scramble the 12th MP Battalion at Fort Myer. Tell them it's a Code 1 priority. A general officer has been illegally detained. I want a 4-man team and a command vehicle on site in 10 minutes. Go." Colonel Evans came back on the line, his voice now a steel whip. "General, an MP team is en route to your location. We are tracking you." The Provost. Marshal's office has been notified. The Army Vice Chief of Staff is being patched in. "Ma'am, are you physically harmed?" "I am uninjured," Isabella replied, "though I have been illegally searched and wrongfully restrained. My property is secure." She looked at Calloway. The man's swagger was gone, replaced by a raw, primal terror. His career was not just over, it was being nuked from orbit, and he was at ground zero. "My phone call is now complete," Isabella said calmly. "You can hang up now, Officer Calloway." Calloway didn't respond. His hand was frozen, the phone still held aloft like a toxic artifact. His mind simply couldn't catch up to the reality of the disaster he had single-handedly created. Frank Miller finally jolted out of his stupor by the mention of the Provost Marshal. The military's top cop fumbled frantically for his own radio. His voice was a panicked squeak. "Dispatch, this is 3, Adam 45. We need Chief Barnett on scene. Sycamore and Hillcrest. Right now. Emergency." But it was too late. Far too late. In the distance from the direction of Washington, D.C., came a new sound. It was faint at first, but growing rapidly louder. It was the unmistakable piercing wail of military police sirens. Help was coming, but not for them. The 10 minutes after the phone call felt like an eternity inside the claustrophobic confines of the patrol car. The only sounds were Frank Miller's ragged breathing and the distant, rapidly approaching sirens. Officer Calloway sat frozen behind the wheel, his face the color of chalk. The phone had fallen from his hand into his lap. Still connected, a direct line to the maelstrom he had unleashed. Isabella could hear the calm, controlled chaos of the Pentagon command center, a symphony of professionals executing a mission. It was a world Calloway had mocked, and a world that was now about to fall on his head like a mountain. General Dubois remained silent. She had fired her shot, a precision-guided missile aimed at the heart of the injustice. Now she simply had to wait for the battlefield damage assessment. The first to arrive was not the military police. It was a black Chevrolet Tahoe lights flashing that skidded to a halt behind the cruiser. The door flew open, and a man in a rumpled suit, his face flushed with panic, ran towards them. It was Police Chief Dale Barnett, a man whose political ambitions far outstripped his leadership abilities. He had clearly been in a meeting yanked out by Miller's terrified radio call. He peered into the back of the cruiser, and saw the woman in handcuffs. He didn't recognize her. He turned on Miller, his voice a furious whisper. "Frank, what in God's name is going on?" My dispatcher said, "You declared an emergency and something about the Pentagon." Before Miller could stammer out a reply, the military sirens became deafening. 2 olive-drab Humvees and a black command SUV screamed around the corner, their movements sharp and tactical. They didn't park, they established a perimeter. 4 military police officers clad in full tactical gear and carrying rifles disembarked with an unnerving speed and efficiency. They fanned out, securing the scene, their expressions grim and unreadable. They ignored the local cops completely. An army captain, a tall, ramrod-straight African-American man, with command presence etched into every line of his face, emerged from the lead Humvee. He moved with a purpose that made Calloway and Miller look like amateurs. His eyes scanned the scene in a fraction of a second, the local police chief, the 2 shell-shocked officers, and the patrol car. He walked directly to the rear door of the cruiser. Calloway jarred into motion by the captain's arrival. Fumbled to unlock the doors. The captain opened the door for General Dubois himself. "General Dubois. I'm Captain Marcus Thorne, 12th MP Battalion," he said, his voice a respectful baritone. He looked at the handcuffs on her wrists, and a flicker of cold anger crossed his face. He turned his head slightly. Sergeant, a burly MP sergeant, was there instantly, a set of handcuff keys already in his hand. "Sir, release the General, Captain." Thorne. "What ought?" The sergeant unlocked the cuffs. The sound of the mechanism releasing was to Calloway and Miller the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. Isabella brought her hands in front of her, rubbing her wrists where the steel had left angry red marks. She didn't look at the officers. She didn't have to. She stepped out of the car, standing tall. In her running clothes, surrounded by uniformed MPs, she still looked more in command than anyone else on the street. "Thank you, Captain Thorne. Your response time was exemplary. We treat every threat to command personnel with utmost urgency, ma'am," he replied. He then handed her a military-issued satellite phone. "The Vice Chief of Staff is on the line for you, General." Isabella took the phone. "Thank you." She turned her back on the scene on the local cops who were now just part of the scenery, and walked a few paces away to speak with one of the most powerful men in the United States Army. Chief Barnett watched this unfold, his face a mask of dawning horror. He finally understood. He turned on Calloway, his voice shaking with a rage born of pure terror. "You idiot," he hissed. "You goddamn credential-stealing, brain-dead idiot. Do you know who that is?" Calloway could only shake his head, mute. "That's Brigadier General Isabella Dubois." Barnett shrieked, his voice cracking. "She lives in the house on the corner, the one with the big oak tree. She's on the Mayor's Advisory Council. She spoke at our damn police academy graduation 2 years ago. What did you do?" Miller looked like he was going to be sick. He remembered now. He'd been there in the back of the auditorium, half asleep. A black woman in a crisp army dress uniform, a star on her shoulder, talking about leadership and service. He hadn't connected the decorated general on the stage with the jogger on the street. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. His prejudice had literally made him blind. Captain Thorne's attention now fell upon the 2 local officers. His expression was utterly devoid of warmth. Officers Calloway and Miller, he said, his voice flat and cold. "Per an agreement between the Department of the Army and the Oak Creek County Prosecutor's Office, we are assuming control of this scene. You will surrender your body camera footage and any written notes related to this incident to me. Now. This is our jurisdiction. Barnett started to protest weakly. Captain Thorne didn't even look at him. His gaze was locked on Calloway. Your jurisdiction ended the moment you illegally detained a general officer of the United States Army. My authority in this matter comes directly from the Pentagon. Do you wish to challenge that authority? Chief Barnett's mouth opened and closed silently. He was a small-town chief. He was being stared down by the full might of the U.S. military. He deflated completely. Give him the cameras, he mumbled to his officers. The two MPs stepped forward and Calloway and Miller, with trembling hands, unclipped their body cameras and handed them over. They also handed over their notepads. They were handing over the evidence of their own execution. As this was happening, a sleek black sedan with government plates pulled up. A man in a sharp suit, an Army Criminal Investigation Division CID agent, stepped out, followed by a woman who introduced herself as a lawyer from the Army Judge Advocate General's JAG Corps. They conferred quietly with Captain Thorne, then with General Dubois, who had finished her call. Isabella walked back over her composure absolute. She looked at Calloway and Miller for the first time since being released. She wasn't angry anymore. She looked disappointed. For 28 years, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying over the entire scene, I have served this country. I have worn this uniform in war zones. I have fought for the ideals of liberty and justice. And today on my own street, you made me feel like I was the enemy. You didn't see a citizen. You didn't even see a person. You saw a stereotype and you acted on it with gross incompetence and prejudice. She paused, letting her words sink in. Your chief knows who I am. That shouldn't matter. I shouldn't have to be a general for you to have treated me with basic human dignity. I should only have to be a human being. Your failure today was not just a failure to follow procedure. It was a failure of character. And in our lines of work, a failure of character is catastrophic. She then turned to Chief Barnett. Chief, your officers are a reflection of your leadership and your department's culture. This was not a simple mistake. This was a symptom of a disease. I will be speaking with the mayor. I will be speaking with the county supervisors. And I will be filing a formal complaint with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. This isn't over. She gave a curt nod to Captain Thorne. Captain, I have my keys. I'll drive my own vehicle home. Thank you and your men for your assistance. It was our honor, General, he said. As Isabella Dubois walked calmly to her, Lexus got in and drove away. The full weight of the situation settled on the three local policemen. They were left standing there, surrounded by silent, heavily armed military personnel. The JAG lawyer and the CID agent then approached them. Officers Miller Calloway, the JAG lawyer, said, her voice pleasant but laced with steel. I'm Major Davenport. You will be required to give a full sworn statement at our offices at Fort Myer tomorrow morning at 0800 hours. You have the right to have legal counsel present. In fact, I strongly recommend it. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Chief Barnett suspended both officers without pay, pending the outcome of the multiple, overlapping investigations that were now underway. The Army's Internal Affairs Division prodded into frantic action by the chief, and soon the DOJ. That evening, Calloway sat in his small apartment, the television off the silence deafening. His phone had been buzzing all day with calls from his union rep, from his precinct sergeant, from his terrified mother. He answered none of them. He kept replaying the events in his head. He had been so sure, so confident in his own authority. He saw a black woman who didn't belong and decided to assert his power. He had never once considered that she might have power of her own, a power so immense it could crush him without a second thought. His ego, his prejudice had led him straight off a cliff. Frank Miller was at home too, but he was drinking. He was trying to drown the image of General Dubois' eyes, her calm, unyielding stare, as she sat in the back of his cruiser. He had known the stop was wrong from the beginning. He had felt it in his gut, but he had done nothing. His silence, his lazy complicity, had made him just as guilty as Calloway. He had been 2 years from a full pension, a quiet retirement, a fishing boat on the lake. Now that was all gone. He had let a rookie's racist arrogance burn down his entire life. The story leaked to the press within hours. A reporter from the Washington Post, tipped off by a source inside the Pentagon, made the first call to Chief Barnett. The chief's stammering no comment was all the confirmation they needed. By the next morning, the headline was on the front page: Army General in handcuffs, Oak Creek Police, accused of racial profiling of decorated officer. The firestorm had begun. And for Michael Calloway and Frank Miller, the world was about to get very, very hot. The week that followed the incident was a masterclass in systemic demolition. The careers of Michael Calloway and Frank Miller were not just ended, they were methodically dismantled piece by piece under the full glare of a national spotlight. General Dubois, true to her word, did not let the matter rest. She understood that a quiet apology and the firing of 2 officers would be a temporary balm on a festering wound. She wanted accountability, but more than that, she wanted change. The sworn statements at Fort Myer were a brutal affair. The JAG lawyers, operating with the clinical precision of surgeons, dissected every second of the encounter. Calloway, arrogant to the last, tried to justify his actions, painting a picture of a high-crime area and a non-compliant suspect. But under a barrage of pointed questions, cross-referencing his testimony with the bodycam footage which the Army now possessed, his story crumbled into a pathetic pile of contradictions and outright lies. The footage was damning. It showed no resistance from the general, only calm, polite responses. It captured Calloway's sneering mockery, his dismissal of her identity, and the entirely unnecessary violence of the arrest. Frank Miller, advised by a frantic union lawyer to cooperate fully, threw himself on the mercy of the investigators. He admitted the stop had no legal basis. He admitted Calloway's actions were driven by prejudice. He admitted that he, as the senior officer, had failed to intervene. His confession was a desperate act of self-preservation, but it only served to cement the case against his partner and himself. He was the silent enabler, and in the eyes of the investigators, his cowardice was as damning as Calloway's aggression. The Oak Creek County internal investigation, normally a slow, opaque process designed to protect its own, was now operating under the Klieg lights of the Pentagon and the Department of Justice. Chief Barnett, trying to save his own skin, threw his officers under the bus with unprecedented speed. Within 48 hours, citing gross misconduct, dereliction of duty, and actions bringing the department into disrepute, he fired them both. But that was just the beginning. The hard karma Isabella Dubois sought was not merely punitive, it was consequential. First came the civil suit, represented by a high-powered Washington, D.C. law firm, working pro bono. General Dubois sued not just Calloway and Miller, but the Oak Creek Police Department and the county itself. The suit wasn't for money. She pledged any settlement to a charity supporting veterans and victims of police misconduct. It was for discovery. It forced the department to open its books to release years of traffic stop data arrest records and internal complaints. The data analyzed by civil rights groups painted a stark and undeniable picture of systemic racial bias. Black drivers in Oak Creek were stopped, searched, and arrested at a rate nearly 10 times that of their white counterparts, despite making up less than 15% of the county's population. Calloway's record was particularly egregious. In his 4 years, he had a documented history of aggressive stops against minorities, with numerous complaints that had been quietly dismissed by his superiors. This data became the cornerstone of the Department of Justice investigation that General Dubois had promised. Federal agents descended on the Oak Creek PD, seizing files and computers. They interviewed dozens of officers and citizens. The investigation revealed a deeply entrenched culture of racial hostility and a blue wall of silence that protected problem officers like Calloway. The consequences for the officers were life-altering. Michael Calloway, stripped of his job and his qualified immunity by the egregious nature of his actions, was financially ruined by the civil suit. The county's insurance refused to cover him due to his willful misconduct. He was forced to declare bankruptcy. More importantly, the state's Peace Officer Standards and Training Post Board permanently revoked his certification, meaning he could never work as a police officer in Virginia or any other state ever again. He became a pariah. Job applications went unanswered. He ended up working as a night shift stocker at a big box store. The remnants of his old authority reduced to telling teenagers which aisle the toilet paper was in. He lost his apartment and had to move back in with his parents, a bitter, angry man broken by the weight of a single, prejudiced decision. Frank Miller's fate was quieter, but just as devastating. His cooperation did not save him. He too was fired and named in the civil suit. The dream of his pension vanished. The board ruled that being fired for gross misconduct 2 years before retirement eligibility made him forfeit the entire amount. Decades of service erased. The fishing boat, the quiet retirement, all gone. His wife, who had stood by him through years of long shifts and stressful nights, left him. She couldn't live with the shame or the man he had become by doing nothing. He sold his house to pay his legal fees and moved into a small rented condo, a ghost haunted by a single moment of weak-willed silence. He had stood by and watched a fire start, and was shocked when his own house burned down. The twist was not just that they were fired, but how the system they represented was forced to turn on itself. Chief Dale Barnett was forced to resign in disgrace after the DOJ report was published. It cited a catastrophic failure of leadership and recommended a federal consent decree to oversee the department's operations for the next decade. The Oak Creek Police Department was effectively taken over by the federal government, forced to implement sweeping reforms in training oversight and community relations. For General Isabella Dubois, there was no celebration. There was a grim sense of satisfaction that a necessary, painful process had been initiated. She became an even more powerful voice for reform, using her platform not to talk about her own experience, but to highlight the countless others who had endured the same treatment without a direct line to the Pentagon. She testified before Congress, her words carrying the immense weight of both a decorated military leader and a victim of the very injustice she was fighting. Her life returned to its rhythm of service and duty, but something had changed. The quiet anger she felt that day never truly left. It became a fuel, a constant reminder of the fight that still remained outside the war zones, right there on the quiet, tree-lined streets of America. The story of her wrongful arrest became a cautionary tale told in police academies and law schools, a stark example of what can happen when prejudice is given a badge and a gun. The karma that hit Calloway and Miller wasn't supernatural. It was simply the logical, crushing conclusion to a path they chose to walk a bill for their arrogance that had finally come due delivered by a woman they were foolish enough to underestimate. The story of General Isabella Dubois is a powerful and sobering reminder that justice is not always guaranteed. Sometimes it must be demanded. Two officers, blinded by their own prejudice, thought they held all the power on that quiet street. They couldn't have been more wrong. They didn't just handcuff a citizen. They challenged an institution and a lifetime of integrity, and the consequences were swift, total, and just. This isn't just a story about a single incident. It's about the systemic issues that allow such injustices to happen, and the incredible strength it takes to confront them. If this story of accountability and hard-earned karma resonated with you, please help us share it. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more true stories of justice, consequence, and the fight for what is right. Your engagement helps us bring these important narratives to light. Thank you for watching.